Secret meeting between Lewis Hamilton and Toto Wolff leaked in Monaco. Want to know what they talked about? Stay until the end and you'll find out. You won't believe it. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. It was one of those unforgettable nights in Monaco when time itself seemed to slow down, when the air carried that electric tension only the principality could conjure, a blend of mystery, wealth, and quiet anticipation. The narrow streets glistened under the golden streetlights, their reflections dancing on the polished surfaces of luxury cars parked carelessly along the curbs. The waves from the harbor whispered against the yachts, the faint sound of laughter echoing from distant terraces where champagne glasses clinked. Yet, away from the glitz and the flash of cameras, hidden behind the familiar facade of the Monte Carlo casino, something rare, almost cinematic, was happening. Behind a narrow alleyway, where only a few locals dared to wander, stood a restaurant known by few but revered by those who did, Le Mirage Bleu. It wasn't the kind of place influencers posted about or paparazzi lingered outside. It was the kind of sanctuary that existed outside time, a place for whispered conversations, closed deals, and buried secrets. The lighting was soft, golden, almost dreamlike, the kind that wrapped around you and made everything feel both intimate and dangerous. That evening, one particular table at the far corner, hidden behind deep blue velvet curtains, held two figures whose reunion could have changed the course of Formula One history: Lewis Hamilton and Toto Wolff. A waiter who worked that night, a man with trembling hands who agreed to talk only under the promise of anonymity, later said the air in that room felt heavier than usual. It wasn't just a dinner, he recalled. It was like watching two worlds collide again after being torn apart. He described the energy as tense, charged with emotion, the kind that makes you lower your voice without even realizing it. When Hamilton entered the restaurant, the waiter noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The music, a soft blend of Miles Davis and Coltrane, seemed to dim, as though the night itself was aware that something important was about to happen. Hamilton wore a simple black hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low enough to shadow his eyes, and no entourage, no flash, no performance. The usual aura of confidence and control that followed him everywhere was replaced by something far quieter: introspection. He moved with caution, scanning every corner of the room, each glance deliberate, as though making sure this meeting wasn't being watched, as if the wrong eyes could turn it into something it wasn't meant to be. He sat down, took a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, not out of impatience, but as if trying to release the tension that had built up inside him over months, maybe even years. Then, 15 minutes later, Toto Wolff walked in. The waiter said the contrast between the two men was striking: Hamilton, cloaked in quiet restraint, and Toto, tall, composed, carrying that aura of authority that never left him, even outside the paddock. But there was no arrogance in his step that night, no businesslike stiffness. Instead, there was something deeply personal, almost hesitant, as though he too was unsure how this encounter would unfold. When Toto saw him, the waiter said, he didn't smile the way a boss smiles when greeting a driver. He smiled like a friend seeing someone he used to share everything with: victories, heartbreaks, midnight calls, and impossible dreams. Their handshake wasn't quick or casual. It lingered, long enough to carry unspoken apologies, unexpressed respect, and the ghost of a bond that once felt unbreakable. They looked at each other, not like rivals or professionals, but like two men who had walked through fire together and were still trying to understand where it all went wrong. The waiter swore that in that brief silence, those few seconds before they sat down, there was more emotion in the air than in any championship celebration. It wasn't anger. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something deeper, heavier, a shared recognition that despite everything that had happened between them, despite the distance, the tension, the fractured loyalty, there remained a spark that time hadn't managed to erase. As they began to talk, their voices were low, measured, almost rehearsed. Hamilton leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes fixed on Toto's, as if searching for something, a sign, a truth, a promise. Toto listened with that same quiet intensity, occasionally nodding, occasionally glancing away, as if each word brought back memories he wasn't ready to relive. The waiter said he couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could feel it, the kind of conversation that changes the air around it. There were no cameras, no microphones, no journalists waiting outside. Just two men, once united by destiny, now separated by choices, meeting again in the shadows of Monaco. And for those who knew what that meeting could mean, those few insiders who later whispered about it behind closed doors, that night at Le Mirage Bleu was not just another secret dinner. It was the beginning of something, a quiet tremor that, in time, might shake the world of Formula One to its core. They ordered dinner quietly, almost ritualistically, like two men carrying the weight of years of history between them. Hamilton, composed yet visibly introspective, requested a plant-based risotto infused with truffle, a dish he chose carefully, as if every ingredient had to match the tone of the evening. Wolff, ever the strategist, went for a grilled sea base, light yet refined. Between them stood a bottle of Chateau Margaux 2015, its cork removed with slow precision, as though even the act of opening it carried significance. The air was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have said too much in the past and now must choose every word with surgical precision. The waiter, who would later recall every detail like a witness to something monumental, remembered how their voices rarely rose above a murmur. Their conversation was hushed, intimate, full of pauses that said more than words ever could. Every so often, their tone would shift, from thoughtful reflection to something sharper, more intense, like the flicker of a flame that refused to die out. They were leaning in close, whispering, the waiter later told someone. At one point, Lewis laughed, but it wasn't his usual big laugh. It was quiet, restrained, the kind of laugh you give when something hurts a little but you're pretending it doesn't. The first part of their conversation wasn't about racing at all. It was about something deeper, something more fragile, trust. Hamilton spoke openly, his voice steady but edged with emotion, about how hard the past few years at Ferrari had been. The politics, the endless internal struggles, the constant pressure to perform, to embody an ideal that was never truly his, it had all worn him down. He confessed that even the victories had felt hollow at times because the unity, the honesty, the collective drive that once defined his years at Mercedes were gone. He told Toto he missed the structure, the transparency, the sense that everyone was truly pushing in the same direction, the waiter said softly, recalling every nuance of that exchange as if he could still hear the words echoing in the candlelit air. Wolff sat back in his chair, listening intently, the faintest flicker of emotion crossing his face now and then. He didn't interrupt, not out of politeness, but out of respect. He let Hamilton's words unfold, layer by layer, like a confession years in the making. When he did finally speak, his tone was calm, deliberate, every syllable measured. "You know, Lewis," he said quietly, "the door was never closed. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even an offer. It was a truth laid bare between them, simple and undeniable." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the city outside seemed distant, muted by the gravity of what hung in the air between them. This was more than dinner between two old colleagues. It was a convergence of past and future, a moment that could alter the course of Formula One itself. Hamilton's gaze softened, his eyes reflecting the flickering gold of the candlelight. He began to speak of legacy, not fame or statistics, but something deeper, the meaning behind it all. He talked about unfinished business, about the sense that something vital had been left unresolved when he left Mercedes. He said he felt like a part of himself had stayed in Brackley, the waiter recalled, his voice low, reverent, as though describing a sacred confession. Hamilton described it vividly, the garage before dawn, the smell of rubber and oil, the quiet hum before the chaos of a race. He said he still dreamed of those mornings, of the sound of engines igniting like thunder, of the calm before the storm when everything in the world made sense for just a moment. He missed the way the team moved as one organism, the unspoken trust, the shared hunger. He said he could still feel it sometimes, that pulse, that energy, the waiter whispered. Like he was still there, even when he was thousands of miles away, wearing red instead of silver. The conversation stretched deep into the night, long after the plates were cleared and the wine glasses stood half empty. Every look, every pause, carried meaning, fragments of old battles, victories, heartbreaks, and dreams that refused to die. Neither man raised his voice, yet the air was electric with everything left unsaid. When they finally stood to leave, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that something historic had just taken place. Not an agreement, not yet, but a spark reignited. And as Hamilton walked out into the cool night, the faint scent of truffle still lingering on the table, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. Both men knew that something had shifted, quietly, profoundly, and that from that moment on, nothing in the world of Formula One would ever be quite the same again. Toto didn't push him. He didn't need to. He knew Lewis too well for that. The tiny pauses, the careful way Hamilton stirred his wine without drinking, the half-smile that wasn't really a smile at all. Toto could feel it in the air. Lewis was probing, not committing, testing the gravity of this meeting, measuring if it was nostalgia or destiny pulling them back together. The silence between their words had its own language, cautious, deliberate, charged with unspoken history. The restaurant lights reflected softly against the glass, painting their table in warm amber tones as the murmur of laughter drifted from nearby diners. Yet around them, there was a stillness, as if the rest of the world had quietly stepped back to let this moment unfold. After the main course, seared sea bass with saffron risotto, neither of which they seemed to taste, the plates were cleared and the waiter refilled their glasses. That was when everything changed. The shift was subtle, but palpable. The waiter would later recall how Toto's demeanor transformed, how the playful ease vanished and was replaced by a rare intensity. Wolff reached into his jacket with deliberate calm, producing a small worn leather notebook. Its edges were creased, as if it had been with him through countless seasons: Monaco nights, boardroom confrontations, podium celebrations. He opened it slowly, flipped a few pages, and then paused on a blank one. No legal binders, no contract templates, no advisors whispering figures. Just the quiet scratch of pen on paper as he wrote down a single number: 20 million euros. A sum that spoke volumes, not of money but of belief. Lewis stared at the page for a long, almost unbearable moment. The waiter said he barely moved, his fingertips drumming softly on the table, his gaze fixed on Toto's eyes, searching them for motive, sincerity, maybe even forgiveness. Neither spoke. The air between them tightened, heavy with the weight of 7 world titles, years of triumph and heartbreak, betrayal and pride. And then Hamilton reached for the pen. He didn't sign his full name. Just 2 letters, elegant, unmistakable, LH. It wasn't a signature, it was a statement. A whisper of intent. Toto smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides emotion beneath control. He folded the sheet carefully, as if it were something fragile, and tucked it back inside his jacket. No handshake, no theatrics, no toasts. They both knew what it meant. Some deals are louder in silence than in words. Outside, the city was alive. The clatter of glasses, the distant hum of jazz, the sea breeze brushing through the open windows of Le Mirage Bleu. But inside that restaurant, time seemed suspended. The waiter brought dessert, a chocolate soufflé, soft and delicate, steam still curling from its center, yet neither of them touched it. Their voices dropped to a murmur, low and serious. They spoke of engineers, of design philosophies, of the endless pursuit of balance and speed. Hamilton asked about George Russell, his tone calm but curious. Toto said George had changed, grown into a fighter, someone who didn't just drive for points anymore but for pride. Lewis nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful, as if weighing the future against the past. He admitted he'd been watching Mercedes' quiet resurgence, their methodical progress, the precision returning to their rhythm. "You can feel the hunger again," he said softly, almost to himself. Then the conversation shifted toward 2026, the new era, the hybrid revolution, the dawn of a grid reborn under new regulations. Toto's words carried conviction. He spoke of the years of hardship, the failures dissected and turned into lessons, the rebuilding of a dynasty not yet ready to fade. "We're not finished," he told him, his voice steady but alive with purpose. "You're not finished. Why not finish it together?" The silence that followed those words was electric, the kind of silence that stretches the heartbeat, that forces a man to confront everything he's been running from. The waiter remembered seeing something flicker in Hamilton's eyes then, a quiet light, the kind that comes when a man starts to believe again. Lewis smiled barely, and whispered, "Maybe it's destiny." It wasn't loud, but it was enough. In that single breath, something shifted, an invisible decision crystallizing between 2 men who'd already lived a lifetime together in the fire of competition. They stayed long after the restaurant emptied. 3 hours, maybe more. Talking about loyalty, strategy, legacy. About how the sport had changed, faster, colder, sharper, and yet how, beneath the politics and PR gloss, it was still the same raw battle it had always been. Toto reminded him that greatness isn't about the trophies or the applause. It's about knowing when to come home, when the circle must close. And as the night bled into the early hours, with the city lights flickering like dying stars outside, Hamilton listened in silence. Maybe he was remembering Silverstone, or Abu Dhabi, or those moments when everything he'd ever worked for was hanging by a thread and somehow he pulled it back. Maybe he was realizing that even the greatest journeys sometimes lead you back to where they began. The waiter swore he saw them both glance at the same empty glass near the end, the one neither of them had touched, and smile in unison, like 2 men who just made peace with time itself. And when they finally stood, they didn't embrace, didn't look back. They simply nodded, as if the road ahead had already been drawn between them, unseen but undeniable. By the time the two men finally stood to leave, the clock had crept far past midnight. The restaurant had emptied hours ago, leaving only the quiet murmur of the staff cleaning up and the soft clinking of glasses being stacked away. Hamilton moved first. He adjusted his hoodie, pulling the fabric low over his face, the same way he had done so many times when he wanted to disappear from the world's endless gaze. Without a word, he gave a brief nod to the waiter, that silent acknowledgement of gratitude from someone who had lived too long under scrutiny, and he slipped out through the narrow back exit, a dimly lit corridor leading into the quiet salt-scented alley that ran behind the casino. His footsteps were soundless, practiced, like a man who knew the value of vanishing before dawn. Toto Wolff remained seated for a few moments longer, his tall frame still, his eyes distant, as if calculating the weight of what had just been said. Then, slowly, deliberately, he rose. As he walked toward the door, he was already pulling out his phone, that cold metallic extension of his will, and typing a message to someone back in Brackley. The waiter, passing by with a tray, caught a fleeting glimpse of the screen. Just one word appeared before it vanished into the encrypted ether: done. That was it. Nothing more. But it carried the finality of a contract, the gravity of a decision that would soon shake the foundations of the Formula One world. That night, not a single camera captured what had happened. There were no leaks, no prying paparazzi hiding in the shadows. The restaurant owner later admitted, under the promise of anonymity, that both reservations had been made under false names. Fake initials, fake phone numbers, everything carefully arranged. But those who worked there knew exactly who they had been serving. They felt the unspoken electricity that hummed between those two men. One, the 7-time world champion who had carried the weight of a dynasty. The other, the architect of that dynasty, now quietly building something new. The staff didn't talk that night, not to each other, not to the press. But they knew. They knew they had witnessed the spark of something monumental, the kind of secret that could ripple through the paddock, through boardrooms, through every corner of the sport once the truth came to light. A few days later, as the morning sun poured through the restaurant windows, the same waiter who had served them noticed a small cream-colored envelope among the morning deliveries. No return address. No markings. Just a clean, expensive paper with a faint scent of cologne. Inside was a short note written in neat, deliberate handwriting: "Thank you for your discretion." Alongside it, 2 tickets, exclusive, VIP access to the Monaco Grand Prix, tucked neatly inside. At the bottom, a signature of 2 simple initials that needed no full name: LH. And that was when the whispers began. Quiet at first, just murmurs in the backrooms of the paddock, in private WhatsApp groups and encrypted voice notes. Engineers were seen traveling between Brackley and Monaco, always under vague pretexts. Some of Hamilton's former crew, faces long associated with his golden Mercedes years, suddenly went silent on social media, deleting posts, refusing interviews. A few insiders began to speak, cautiously, off the record. They claimed that the 2026 Mercedes chassis, internally codenamed Phoenix, had been designed with one driver in mind. A driver who knew what it meant to fall, to rebuild, and to rise again from the ashes. Officially, no one said a word. Mercedes refused to comment. Hamilton's camp remained silent. But inside every garage, every motorhome, every press room, people were talking. The story had begun to take on a life of its own, a living rumor, a ghost that haunted every corner of the grid. Journalists started piecing together fragments of the puzzle: a secret dinner in Monaco, a message that said done, a note signed LH, and the question that echoed louder with each passing day: was this how it began? The prodigal return of Lewis Hamilton to the team that had built his legend, to the silver machine that once made him untouchable? In the nights that followed, Monaco seemed different. The air itself felt charged, as if holding a secret too big to contain. Somewhere along the harbor, beneath the soft hum of luxury yachts and the glimmer of champagne glasses, an engine roared faintly in the distance. It wasn't the sound of a tourist boat or a sports car tearing through the streets. It was deeper, purer, a mechanical growl, like a heartbeat awakening after years of silence. Some said it was just the echo of the past, a ghost of the V6 hybrid era. Others swore it was a test, a private shakedown, hidden from all eyes, marking the return of something long thought gone. And in that faint, distant echo of an engine, there was something unmistakable, a memory waiting to be reborn, a promise reigniting under the midnight sky. Because legends, no matter how far they drift, always find their way back to the machines that made them immortal.